Oh no, everyone's leaving. Bye. Well, it was daunting even before you left. And the reason is because some of you have a deeper understanding of SDT science in your thumb than I may have in my whole body. But what I've been doing for the last, well, I'm not going to count the years, but since 1995, when I first read Why We Do What We Do by Dr. Edward Deci, I became single-mindedly focused on a life purpose of taking the compelling research that you do and translating it and helping to make it applicable so we could teach it to people so that they could improve the quality of their life. This is my 5th SDT conference, and I keep trying to absorb more and more. But I have to say that I'm not sure I should call this presentation a journey from theory to practical application. It really might be more of an adventure to the other side of complexity. And that's what we find in the workplace, because I decided that even though SDT is relevant to every life domain, where I wanted to really practice it was in the workplace, because 75% of the time that people spend awake as an adult is spent connected to their work. It's getting up, getting ready for work, it's working, it's decompressing from work. And so we have the greatest opportunity, perhaps, to really affect the quality of people's life through their work. So I started a company called Mojo Moments, and we have people from all over the world that are practicing SDT and teaching it and evolving it. But I want to quote, I don't know if anyone was in Chris, is it Nemechek? Is that, how do you see Chris's last name? Nemec. His session on a proposed intervention for leadership. And it was proposed because they haven't really been able to get it into an organization yet. And when he was describing that, he said, you know what? It's just really, 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 really hard to do organizational research. And I would challenge that it's even more challenging to try to implement training programs and strategies at all levels of leadership in organizations. And let me just give you a couple of examples of why I think this is. One is that you have to sell somebody that these ideas, which are so different and contrary to traditional top-down, leader-centric, command and control leadership, that this is worth even thinking about. So I had an experience. It was what I'm going to describe to you is kind of the good news, bad news. The good news was that there was a major organization, 50,000 people globally, 150 countries. They have active plants and offices. And they put out an RFP, a request for a proposal, to help increase the scores or improve the scores on their Gallup engagement survey. And there was 4 items in particular they wanted to improve. Well, we won that RFP, much to the chagrin of Gallup, who also had submitted a proposal. And so they literally sent us around the world, and we did really wonderful interventions. When I say interventions, it was a really comprehensive training. And then we had focus groups, and we had what we called engagement catalysts. So we had a whole program of coaching over time. And then when we were done, they did the Gallup survey, and they found that the hundreds of people that we had interacted with had significantly higher Q12 scores than the general population. Now that's really good news, right? I mean, that was very exciting. We felt really good about that. But then they had an organizational redesign, and the people who had championed our whole thing were moved to a different department, and they ended up quitting. So it's like you take 2 steps forward and another step back. Another example is that I was so thrilled when the president of one of the top 3 investment firms in the world happened to read my book, Why Motivating People Doesn't Work and What Does, and he wanted to talk to me at his 50th floor penthouse office in New York City. It's like, okay, cool. And I got there, and he was really intrigued with a chapter in the book called The Danger of Drive. So he had asked his internal communications people to take their internal communications and erase the word drive from every piece of literature, because he thought it reflected an external motivation that he was trying to change and shift in the organization. And then I worked with 250 of their financial advisors to really help them understand their basic psychological needs. It was wonderful. And we had a behavioral scientist on the team who was measuring, differences in financial success of the people that the financial advisors were advising. We were going to do a white paper. And then the political tone in America changed. And the president of the company realized he was fighting an uphill battle in terms of his values and what he was hoping for the organization. And he retired. So again, it's like 2 steps forward, a step back. But we're undaunted. I think that one of the things that we're finding, and I don't know if you've found this too, is that there's really this movement towards more external motivation in organizations. You'd think it'd be just the opposite, right? Given what we're all doing, and have been doing for years. But what we've discovered is that there's 3 reasons that these external rewards keep getting proliferated and why external motivation is still so embraced. And one reason is because, I think, of laziness. It's like we need people to do stuff, and we don't have the time, or not going to take the time to figure out more meaningful reasons for people to do what they do. It's easier just to throw incentives, rewards, and tokens at them. It's also a remnant of, as I said, that top-down, leader-centric, command and control type of leadership. I think the second reason that it proliferates, the external rewards, is because they don't understand alternatives. And that's really our job, is to help them understand that there are indeed alternatives. And I think the third reason that's really been very apparent over the last 5 or 6 years is leaders are desperate. I think they feel that people are becoming more agentic, that they are seeking greater senses of autonomy, and they're afraid. They don't know how to control them anymore, and so they're desperate, and they keep throwing the incentives, rewards, and tokens at everyone. So that's kind of the milieu that we're working within. And then the third thing that I think makes this really challenging is that SDT is really complicated. It's complex. And that's the beauty of it, right? It's what you described on the first day, the building blocks, and over time, just really making sure that it was solid and that every piece of the puzzle was coming together in an empirical and in a science-based way. But it's complex. And so our job has been to try to get to the other side of complexity while still honoring what you all are doing in your research. So that's what I want to share with you, is a little bit of what we've had to do to try to simplify but still honor the depth and the richness of SDT in the workplace. So one of the first things we've had to do is get away from the fluffy concept of motivation. Motivation has baggage, because everybody's written a motivational book or some inspirational story based on their own experience. And so people think it's a fluffy topic. So what we really have tried to do is to say, no, wait a minute. Motivation is foundational. You can't do anything without motivation. That is the essence of thriving. That motivation is at the heart of everything we do and everything we don't do but we wish we did. And so what we need to do is tie motivation to feedback, goal setting, coaching, contingency theory leadership. And so part of our job has been to position what we're teaching as foundational to leadership and workplace performance. Not all motivation is created equal. Quality matters. So we're actually trying to change people's language. We're trying to rid people from saying, are you motivated? Are you not motivated? Instead, we're asking, why are you motivated? So we want people to start to really think about not the quantity of motivation people have, but the quality. The other thing we're really trying to do is make a distinction between physical energy and psychological vitality. And so what's really resonated for people is when I say, have you ever had one of those mornings where you've slept well, you've eaten well, you're getting exercise, but you can't drag yourself out of bed in the morning? Why is that? It has nothing to do with your physical energy. It has everything to do with your psychological vitality. And motivation, as we're defining it, is psychological vitality, if it's optimal motivation. So we're trying to create as I said, a foundational approach to motivation. Now, the other thing we had to do was we had to change the language. In my first book in 2014, I was so adamant about sticking with SDT language, autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And then years later, as the second book was coming out and the first book had been translated into 14 different languages, my publisher said, you know, Susan, you really have to change that language because it's just too hard for the average person and it's too hard to translate. I argued, but I lost that argument, and I don't know if you even remember, Rich, but I actually contacted you and said, is it okay if I change it to choice, connection, and competence? Because it's just easier for people. And I can't even tell you that people have resonated, you know, just by changing the language. So I feel a little bit badly about it, but I also am into making it sticky, making it relatable. We really started off trying to work with individuals and teaching them how to identify a motivational outlook, shift their motivational outlook, and then reflect on it. So we had these actions for the individual. But then when I talked to Edward Deasy and showed him what we were trying to do, he said, we are simpatico. We agree with your approach, but he says, but one caveat. You cannot teach leaders how to do this with others until they can do it for themselves. So whereas we started off trying to teach individuals how to, what we're now calling need crafting, we had realized that the workplace was only going to spend money, really spend money to train or teach leaders. But then Ed Deasy said, okay, but first you really have to teach the leaders how to do this for themselves. So it's kind of like we've been bouncing around trying to find the right approach. And I think that we've landed where we're teaching leaders how to master motivation with others and explaining to them that they can't do it with others unless they can do it for themselves. So we've really kind of merged those two concepts. So what we've now teaching is what we call leadership capacities. We didn't want to get into leadership competencies. I don't know if you've looked at an organization's list of competencies recently. They're a mishmash of stuff from Maslow, from Skinner, from McClelland, from Fayol and other 18th century or 19th century managerial theorists. And so a lot of the competencies that we're holding leaders accountable for are so outdated and are really based on theories that have been either disproven or never proven. So we didn't want to get into the whole idea of leadership competencies. Instead, in order to make this foundational, what we decided to do was to create leadership capacities that are foundational so that as leaders went into these other competencies, they would be looking through the lens of SDT. So how do you encourage choice, deepen connection, and build competence? And through the work of Hardray and Reeve and other SDT researchers, plus the research has been done often by my husband, Dr. Drea Zagarmi, on situational leadership, we have identified 12 behaviors that we really believe do encourage choice, deepen connection, and build competence, and that is what we are teaching managers. The other thing we wanted to do was we wanted to tie what we were doing based on SDT, but to other ideas such as servant leadership. You know, you hear about servant leadership, it's really popular, transformational leadership, but no one's really quite sure what you do to be a servant leader or to be a transformational leader. And so what we were, I think, we've gotten a lot of positive response from taking Robert Greenleaf's idea of servant leadership, and what he said, the way he defined servant leadership, was that a servant-first leader focuses on people's highest priority needs. And now we know what people's highest priority needs are. They are people's basic psychological needs. So we're able to tie what we're doing to servant leadership. We also try to incorporate research outside of SDT, but make the alignment. So here's an example. In 2022, the McKinsey Company did a global study to understand what happened during the Great Resignation. And they asked people, what are the reasons that you left your job? They really wanted to understand the phenomenon. And what they found was there were 3 primary reasons that really jumped out, and this is global research. The first one was a lack of autonomy and flexibility. In fact, in their report, the subhead is actually anything for autonomy. The second was escape a toxic culture and meaningless work. The third was a desire for growth and learning opportunities. Now, it shouldn't surprise any of us here that those 3 reasons cited were around choice or autonomy, relatedness or connection, and competence. So when people see this type of research that's aligned, it's really, really powerful. So what we did was we put together, putting what we knew about SDT and self-regulation, we created a model called the Spectrum of Motivation model. And this model is what I call descriptive and prescriptive. So it describes the 6 motivational outlooks based on the quality of psychological needs that someone experiences, and it prescribes action. If someone is suboptimal, how do they get to optimal? Then they do it through self-regulation. Now, we have eschewed the terms intrinsic and extrinsic, because here was another thing that's happening, was that leaders think, oh, there's 2 kinds of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. So if I'm a sales manager and I have a salesperson who hates to do paperwork or cold calling or some other aspect of their sales role, if they're not intrinsically motivated to do it, then what's my alternative? Must be extrinsic motivation. And so they keep falling or defaulting back to external motivation. So we've decided to stay away from the binary choice of intrinsic and extrinsic and really take a look at what we call suboptimal and optimal motivation. And we're positioning that, are people motivated by money and power and status? Yes. But that doesn't mean that that's the best alternative, that you have choices about the way you can be motivated. And so optimal motivation is a better way to be motivated than suboptimal motivation. And so we go into what the differences are between low energy and vitality, and the research on creativity, innovation, productivity, well-being, et cetera. I'd like to just give you an example of why I appreciate our model. I was doing a presentation for 350 pharmaceutical sales reps, and it was in Malaysia, and it was people who were from APAC and Africa. And I always start with an exercise, because I want people to have a motivational experience before we explain the model. So we did, it's called the heads or tails activity. Everyone stood up, and I said, I'm gonna flip a coin, and while it's in the air, just yell out heads or tails. If you guess right, you stay standing. If you get it wrong, you sit down. Last person standing is going to win an iPad mini. Now, I had no idea when I said that. I mean, the entire room erupted. They were so excited. An iPad mini, really cool. So they all stand up, and I start flipping the coin. And even with that large of a group, it only takes a couple of coin flips before you get to like the final 10. So I brought the final 10 up front, and I did one more coin flip, and sure enough, 9 people guessed wrong, but one guy got it right, Mohammedan. He was so excited. He jumped up on the stage, and he was a rather large young man, and so the whole thing was bouncing. And he was so excited that he grabbed my microphone, and it turns out that he was a pharmaceutical sales rep by day, but a karaoke singer by night. So he starts singing, and he sings in Arabic, and they do the response, and then he's singing, and they're responding, and pretty soon everyone's standing and dancing and singing, and I thought, okay, I've totally lost control here, but it was so cool. It was really, really, so I thought it was wonderful. So I finally got my microphone back and gave Mohammed the iPad mini, and I think, boy, this is just going well, and I explained the model. Where's the model? Oh. Can't see it. I've seen people do that up here this week, and I realized you can't point. If you're disinterested, I said, you might have been disinterested. In other words, you didn't want to do the activity. You weren't pressured or stressed or anything. You just didn't want to do it, but you went through the motions. Or maybe you were externally motivated. You really wanted the iPad mini and you wanted to win. Or maybe you were feeling imposed and you only did it because your boss is sitting 2 rows behind you and you were afraid of what might happen if you didn't do the activity. Or maybe you were aligned. You're not sure why this activity is being done, but you're here to learn. This is a learning experience, and you have a value for learning, and so you went along with it for the value of learning. Or maybe you're integrated, and this is just who you are. This is how you self-identify. You are a person who makes the most of a moment, and you're in that moment, and you're going to take advantage of it. Or maybe it's inherent, which is the most purely intrinsic of all the motivational outlooks, and that you just are so excited about doing an activity. It's just fun, and it's enjoyable. So I explained the model. Lunchtime comes, and the director comes up to me, and he's a fairly intimidating man, I must say, and he comes up to me and goes, "Susan, we have a problem." I go, "What?" And he says, "Mohammed cheated." I go, "What do you mean he cheated?" "Well, when you were tossing the coin, even if he got it wrong, he just stayed standing. And it just so happens that he ended up guessing right at the end." And I said, "How do you know this?" He goes, "He told me." And I said, "Well, why would he tell you?" And he says, "Because he feels so guilty. He's ashamed." And so the director was all upset, and I said, "Well, that's really interesting. Let me talk to Mohammed." So I talked to him, and Mohammed told me his story, and I asked him if after lunch he would be willing to share it with the group. He agreed, but he was so nervous that he wrote his confession out on paper. And after lunch, he stood up on the stage again, and his hands were literally shaking as he described his experience. How he'd gotten the iPad mini, went back to his seat, and was just kind of curious why he didn't feel as joyful and as excited as he thought he would. And it wasn't until he saw the model that he realized that he had been externally motivated, that he wanted to win. And it wasn't just the iPad mini. He wanted the adulation. He wanted the attention. He wanted people to love him. And when he realized that he had actually cheated to get that he had belied his own values for integrity and honesty, and that he wanted to be aligned, that was the person he wanted to be, and he hadn't been that person. And as a result, he wanted to return the iPad mini. 350 people stood up, and this time gave him a standing ovation for the right reasons. And we redid the activity and gave the iPad mini to a very deserving young woman. But that was such a powerful moment when you realize that even though less than 15% of human beings are actually self-reflective, that if we give them some structure, if we give them a model that they can then look at and understand what they're going through, that we tap into that natural desire to thrive. And then if we can teach them the skills on how to do that on a more regular basis, then I think, we've got some hope there. So I know I'm running out of time, but what we're really trying to teach is what we're calling psychological sense. That we want a person's, psychological sense is a person's emotional and cognitive ability to fulfill psychological needs and experience optimal motivation, a state of thriving, and sustained performance. That's our mission. That's what we're really hoping to try to do. And in one organization that we've been working with for quite a while, Innova Systems, they were tracking employee retention, and you could see that they were actually lower than the national average for software developers. And then in 2015, 2016, we implemented our methodology around motivation and actually some employee work passion work that my husband's doing, and a leadership initiative, and look at what happened to their retention. We also really worked with them on how to announce a hybrid work program during COVID, and they saw their retention actually go up, along with a lot of other measures that they were looking at. So we've had some success, and we're now really working to apply what we do to various aspects of the workplace. And I don't have time to go into all of these. And since I figure if Dr. Valoran did this, maybe I could do it. A shameless plug that if if you want to, I just updated, it just came out on May 16th, the second edition of Why Motivating People Doesn't Work and What Does, and we incorporated all of this stuff that we've learned about hybrid work and a lot of how to apply what's happening in the world today, especially post-COVID. And if you're flying, it's going to be in bookstores. That's really shameless. Okay, but anyway. So here's my final wish. I think that we have maybe the greatest opportunity in our history to change the way we lead. And I mean that at every level, from self-leaders to organizational leaders. And to create a workplace where producing results doesn't compromise people's health and well-being, but that actually promotes thriving. And I just was so thrilled to be here. You know why? Because I wanted to thank you for the work that you do, because without it, we wouldn't be out there trying to make a difference. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart.